Hey everybody, it is Charlie, the Commie Preacher. So glad you're watching this video. Welcome to the Church of the Revolution YouTube channel. Here, as you always, we preach that Jesus was a communist. And if you have a question, how can Jesus be a communist? Go ahead and watch. I have 3 videos that I have done. One is short and a synopsis, and the other 2 are more in-depth, developing this belief that Jesus was a communist. You don't have to believe anything else. You don't have to believe Jesus was the Son of God. You don't have to believe that Jesus was God in the flesh. You don't even have to believe that Jesus existed. I think he did. I think the evidence is reasonable. And that's not just as Christians. There are plenty of non-Christians who believe the evidence is pretty good that there was a real Jesus. But be that as it may, even if you believe it was a myth, was that myth communist? I believe so. So, this video is a response to a request. I asked people on Facebook, I said, what should my next Commie Preacher video be about? And one friend of mine, so why not do one on theology and its role in the revolution? I'm like, how about I do it on religion and then talk about theology? Because I think religion emerges before theology. Theology is in a sense about religion. And so we have to understand religion first. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. What is religion? And we're going to turn not to the Bible, although everything I say is influenced by how I understand the Bible, for good or bad. If I think the Bible was wrong about something, which it often is, I'm influenced to say that's wrong. And I don't make those parts of the Bible that particularly victimize women, people, vulnerable people, people who don't believe a certain ideology, a certain theology. I don't need that kind of religion. So I read the Bible with a critical lens. And if you want to know more about that, you can look up my video entitled Blow Up Your Bible. That will help you understand a little bit of how I approach the Bible. But today we're going to get beyond the Bible. We're going to talk about religion. Now, what is religion? And we're going to talk about religion as the opium of the masses, according to Karl Marx. So we're going to actually look at this passage where Karl Marx made that infamous statement. So the statement that religion is the opium of the masses occurs in a text called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right that was written in 1843 to 1844 by Karl Marx. And it was an introduction to a longer piece, which is this Contribution to a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. This is the introductory chapter, if you will, of that book. And this chapter begins with religion, which is kind of interesting. This is 1843. The Communist Manifesto came out in 1848, which was 5 years later. So there's approximately a 5-year gap between this text by Marx and the collaborative text with Marx and Engels for the Communist Manifesto. So it's interesting that Marx begins this text. He's going to tell you about Hegel. He's going to critique Hegel's philosophy of right. Now, what is a philosophy of right? It's essentially a philosophy of rights. We talk more about rights than right, but it's a philosophy of order, a philosophy of human rights, human privileges, and where right ultimately comes from. And so it's in a sense a social philosophy. And Marx's critique of Hegel is I have never really read the rest of this text. I've only read this first chapter, or this introductory chapter. And it is kind of funny that it occurs in a book on Hegel's philosophy of right, and yet the thing people remember about it is not what he said about Hegel's philosophy of right, but rather what he says about religion in specific, which really doesn't have a lot to do with Hegel's philosophy of right. I mean, Hegel was a religious philosopher, so in a certain sense, religion has everything to do with his philosophy of right because it emerges from his religious conviction. But Marx, as he's getting ready to critique Hegel's philosophy of right, he begins by talking about the criticism of religion. And his first line is, for Germany, the criticism of religion has essentially been completed, and the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. So he's saying, in order to criticize Hegel's philosophy of right, we have to criticize Hegel's religion. We have to criticize religion in general before we can begin to criticize Hegel's philosophy of right. That's abstract, that's academic, you don't need to know that. Because the phrase in this fourth paragraph, so we're going to go down to paragraph 4. That was the first paragraph, which is just one line. The criticism of religion has been essentially completed. Criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. And then in the fourth paragraph, Marx makes several statements about religion that are going to be the basis of what we're going to talk about today. Marx says that religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, I use, opium of the masses, which is how I learned the phrase when I was first hearing about this terrible atheist Karl Marx. It was because he said religion was the opium of the masses, which means it's a drug, which means it's something that the masses are addicted to, that it's a pain, that it's an evil thing, because addiction is evil. Well, these are better times. I think we understand that addiction is a disease. And in particular, addictions are self-medicating. And so to say that religion is an opium is to say it is the way that this oppressed creature that Marx is talking about medicates their pain. Now, we need to understand that in Germany, opium wasn't illegal. Marx probably used opium as a painkiller at some point in his life because he had terrible pain. He had a disease called carbuncles, which are basically these growths on your skin that are very painful. And Marx, probably had to use opium or painkillers to get rid of that pain. So when he talks about the oppressed creature, Marx knew, although this text is written when he was a young man, Marx knew, at least later in his life, what it meant to be an oppressed creature because of his disease that he lived with, the carbuncles. He lived with them for much of his adult life. And he was in constant pain, according to things that he wrote about the pain. So I'm going to go back to this. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against suffering. So we're led to believe that Marx understood religion only as the justification of social relations, that religion, and particularly the bourgeoisie religion, was about justifying class domination. But Marx says, not so fast. It's actually a protest against suffering. And since class domination causes suffering, religion is a protest against it. Now, Marx believed it was an ineffective protest, and he makes that clear as you go through this long passage. And I recommend that you read it. It's widely available on the internet. Just search for Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Marx. You'll find it. And it's an interesting passage to look at this because, there's some other things that I'm not going to get to today, because for me, everything that Marx ever said about religion pales in comparison to what he says in this one paragraph. Religious suffering is at one and the same time an expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. The idea that religion is not a protest against real suffering, that religion is simply the justification of domination and exploitation, is not Marx's own view. I want to say that again. Marx didn't believe that religion is purely justified, purely exists to justify bourgeois domination or class domination, which it did in the feudal period. It did do all those things. He's not saying it doesn't, but he's saying that religion protests against those things. but it protests against them in a particular way that he would call alienated. Religion says, yeah, your suffering is awful. And you don't have a lot of power in this life to do a damn thing about all your suffering. But God is paying attention to how you live, whether you live a good life, whether you are kind, whether you are just, whether you are moral. And if God judges that you are worthy, you will live in a paradise after you die. Now, Marx had no patience with that view. I have no patience with that view. I am not one of those people who believe that dying and going to heaven is anything to do with the teachings of Jesus or with the religion of Jesus. Jesus was Jewish, and the Jewish people, up until just about the time that Jesus came and began preaching, didn't believe in dying and going to heaven. There were a few people who did, a few Jews who did believe in dying to go to heaven, but they got that idea from the Greeks and the Romans. They didn't get that idea from Judaism. Judaism didn't talk about dying and going to heaven. They talked about another thing, which is the resurrection. And if you want to know what I believe about the resurrection, I just did an Easter video earlier in the week. And I recommend you go there and I'll talk about the resurrection there. But that's not what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about, what does it mean to say religion is an opium? It's a painkiller. It's a way of dealing and coping with suffering and oppression. Marx says, and this to me is the most important phrase, and if I ever write a book on religion, I will call it The Heart of a Heartless World. In fact, I'm going to probably write that book. That's probably my third or fourth book. Yeah, I've got 3 books. I'm going to write Jesus Made Me a Communist, then I'm going to write The Galilean Uprising, the communism of Jesus, the early Jesus movement, and then I'm going to write, Heart of a Heartless World as a book on religious suffering. And then I've got to read The Communism of Love, or Universal Love, The Communism of Universal Love, which will be a more complete philosophical, theological analysis of my religious belief. So those are the 4 books. And if you support my channel, here he comes, you're supposed to in the middle of your YouTube videos. So I'm telling you, this is what they tell me. If I want to get more subscribers at the middle of my videos, I have to invite people, hey, hit that subscribe button. Hey, hit that bell so that you get notified every time I create a new video. Hey, go to my Patreon page and become a Patreon supporter. $1 a month minimum. And you can give me as much as you want or as little as you want. And I will never charge for my content. The Commie Preacher will always be free. Okay. Let's get back to Religion is the Heart of a Heartless World, which is the title of my book. And I think the core of a Marxist approach to theology and religion should be, what is the heart of a heartless world? And it is religion. And that religion is communism. Now, Marx may not have believed that communism was a good religion. Marx was fully aware of Christian communists. There were many of them in Germany when he was becoming a communist. He knew they existed. He knew that they were important in the movement, and yet he wanted to see most of those Christian communists go away. He thought that they were not genuinely devoted to revolution. And he's right. A lot of them were not. But they were devoted to protest. They were devoted to uniting the people for liberation, but they weren't thinking like dialectical Hegelian revolutionaries like Marx and Engels were. And he's right. The Christianity of his time, including the Christian communists, were not particularly good at social scientific thinking. Social scientific thinking was just becoming a reality. Feuerbach, who was very important in influencing Marx to become an atheist, Feuerbach was one of the early social thinkers. And of course, Comte later on invented sociology. But actually, I want to say that Marx was studying people like, and I'm going to forget this, the guy who was considered, Adam Smith, considered the greatest of the British political economists. Marx knew Adam Smith very well. He also knew Ricardo, who was another great political economist. Marx himself was pretty much a political economist. And why do I mention that? What does that have to do with religion? Is that when Marx decided that Wilhelm Wittling, who was the founder of the League of the Just that both Engels and Marx joined, which was a group of communists in Germany who were plotting to participate in a pan-European revolution against capitalism. Marx and Engels pushed Wilhelm Wittling out of the leadership of the League of the Just and renamed it the Communist League. It was changed from League of the Just to the Communist League. Now, I don't think Wittling objected to calling it the Communist League, but the fact is that Wittling was shoved out of an organization he founded, and in part because, and I don't think Marx and Engels were entirely wrong, Wittling was not really thinking in scientific revolutionary, scientific socialist terms. And as a religious communist, I absolutely believe that we need a scientific socialism. We need a socialism that is based on the best possible political science, political economy. And Wittling, that wasn't his bag. And it probably got in the way of him being an effective organizer. We'll never know. You know, that I feel bad for Wittling. I think getting him kicked out of the Communist League was probably not the best moment for Engels and Marx. They clearly had an in for the guy. If you read the letters, they write letters about Wittling and how idealistic and how poor his political philosophy was. And they're not wrong, but it's a complicated thing. All right. So here we go. I have stated that I believe that Marx's characterization of religion as the heart of a heartless world is the best one-sentence definition of religion in all of literature. And this one paragraph, with the exception of the opium of the people, that sentence stands kind of on its own. It isn't fully integrated into the earlier sentences. So what does it mean to say religion is the heart of a heartless world? Well, we're talking about the capitalist world. We're talking about the world dominated by the bourgeoisie, by the revolutionary European anti-feudalists, the people who rejected feudalism, the people who rejected monarchy and established what we call representative democracies. Marx was saying that revolution was a betrayal of the true liberation of humanity, that he believed that the elements of liberating humanity could have been accomplished by the bourgeois revolutions, but had actually, their own class interests made it highly unlikely that they would have supported the true liberation of the working classes and of the suffering of oppressed. And so Marx began his project of organizing the great proletarian revolution in Europe and dedicated his life to creating works of political economy in order to advance scientific socialism and revolutionary communism. Now, the problem, if there is a problem, is that Marx's theory of religion, which he states here, religion is the heart of the heartless world, is the soul of soulless conditions, which are, to me, some of the best descriptions of what religion is. He never built on it. He never developed it out because he wasn't interested. He was interested in politics and economy. He wasn't really interested in religion. But I am. So my project here, in my Heart of a Heartless World, is an attempt to explicate what religion is on a universal scale. And I'm not talking about Christianity. I'm not even talking about Jesus at this point. I'm not talking about Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Chinese traditional religion. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. But I'm talking about all of it. What is the core? What is at the core of all religion? Is there a core? And I would say it is what Marx said it is. the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. Humanity finds itself in a world that it cannot find freedom and satisfaction. For some reason, we are constantly suffering and struggling to create a better life and a better world for ourselves. Humanity for millennia have been struggling to make this world a better place. And the primary vehicle of that has been religion. And it is only in the modern era, which is Marx living at the end of the Enlightenment, that we begin to see that there is, in fact, a secular path towards this goal of liberating humanity and all other living beings. I am an ecologist, a radical ecologist. You notice I've got a green t-shirt, and I've got my red star and my black star merged together. The black star is for freedom. The red star is for justice. Freedom and justice. That's what the red and black mean. And then the green means ecology, means the earth. Okay, I digress. Religion is the heart of heartless world, which, if to really make it simple, is that religion is a search for love. Now, love includes a number of things. A world that is perfectly loving will be a world with perfect justice, a world with perfect freedom, a world where there will be no poverty, a world where there will be no political oligarchy, where there will be no white supremacy, no racism, there will be no patriarchy, no white male domination or domination by any male group over women and non-men. That will be a world of love. Cornel West, one of my favorite socialist thinkers, and that's going to mark me off. Some people think Cornel West is just a liberal social democrat, and to a degree he is. But he said something that really is said a lot. Justice is what love looks like in public. That if we truly use our love to craft our laws and institutions, what we will achieve will be justice. And I believe that religion, this heart of a heartless world, is a search for the fulfillment and perfection of a collective global love. And to me, that is a theological project as much as it is a philosophical and a political project. So one of the friends who suggested that I do a video on theology, I said, I'm going to start with religion, then we're going to get to theology. And I've just introduced what I understand theology to be. Theology is an attempt to understand what love is. It is theology. That is, theo means God. God means power. God also means love. The first epistle of John in the Christian scripture, chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, are two verses that I memorized when I was a very, very young kid, because we actually had a song that sang these verses. But I'm gonna say it to you in a non-binary, inclusive translation. 1 John 4, 7 and 8 go as follows. Beloved, it addresses all the beloved. Let us love one another, for love is divine. Love comes from the goddess. Everyone who loves is born from the goddess. He who does not love, the one who does not love, does not know our goddess, does not know the divine being. For the divine being, goddess, is love. I'm going to sing this song. I've just given you a inclusive, gender complex rendering of that verse, but the song goes simply like this: Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. One who does not love does not know God, for God is love. I messed it up. Basically, that's what those verses say. One who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Goddess, the divine, infinite being, is love. And so communism, as the search for love on earth, to create justice that is love lived in public, a perfect justice, a true justice, not an artificial justice, not a justice of one class against another class, but a justice that liberates all humanities from class domination, from patriarchy, from delivers all the living species of the world from ecocidal death and destruction. That can only come about through love. Now, we think of love as a mushy, romantic notion. But love, I think, is symbolized in how a mother cares for her infant, or can care. Actually, not just a mother. I'm going to say a parent cares for their infant, because whether it's a female caregiver or a male caregiver, I believe that men, I'm a father, I have 2 children who are now in their 30s. I love my children, and I loved them when they were born, and I cared for them, and I changed their diapers, and I fed them. I couldn't breastfeed them, that was my wife, but I did almost everything else for my children. I loved them. I wanted them to have the best possible life. Jesus called God his father and his mother because God is love. Goddess, the divine being, is love. That is what theology is. Theology is an exploration of love as the ultimate key to liberation and transformation in the world. Now, I'm going to go really into a theology here for you. So, I was asked to cover some theology in this, and I'm talking about religion, but now I'm going to get into theology. All right, and we're almost at half an hour, and this is going to go long. I'm just going to tell you right now, this video is going to go long. But this is my second take, and I already know where I'm going. Early Christianity was convinced that Jesus had become God because they experienced him as alive after he was crucified. Jesus, the communist leader, the leader of the Alien uprising, the rebel against the Roman Empire, against all empires everywhere, Jesus was crucified by the Roman governor with Jewish leaders who were collaborating with him because they felt he was endangering their meager existence as is. He was dead. His followers couldn't understand why he died. They couldn't understand. We believed he was the Messiah, and they did. Jesus never really said he was the Messiah, but he also didn't really say he wasn't. Jesus is crucified, and his followers ran away. They couldn't handle it. I did a video on the resurrection a few days ago if you want to get more deeply into the resurrection and what that symbol means. But basically what happened is that after Jesus died and he was gone and his followers didn't know what to do once he was gone, they began to experience visions of him alive. They would get together and they would have a meal, and they would remember that Jesus ate meals with them, and while he ate, he taught them about the arrival of the divine regime and the communism of love on earth. And they said, Jesus can't be dead. We're experiencing his power right now amongst us. I believe the original understanding of the resurrection was of a spiritual resurrection. Didn't mean it had nothing to do with the body of Jesus, because Judaism is nothing if not a embodied religion. And so in a certain sense, they came to believe that if they were experiencing the presence of Jesus in their reuniting of the movement after the crucifixion, that it was because his body had become transformed, as Paul would say, from an earthly body into a spiritual body. From an earthly body into a heavenly body, from a psychical body to a spiritual body. And so the resurrection of Jesus was an experience, a vision that this communist rebel who had led them into the city of Jerusalem to protest the Roman Empire itself, that his crucifixion was not the end of the rebellion. The rebellion could go on, it could continue, because Jesus had left his presence with them, that he had been resurrected. And they quickly began to believe that he was taken into heaven and was in fact God. Now, where does that come from? Where does the idea that Jesus went into heaven and came back? It comes from Augustus. Caesar Augustus. Not Augustine the theologian in the 3rd or 4th century. No, Caesar Augustus. It was said that when, or is it maybe Julius? Maybe it's Julius Caesar, but one of the Caesars, and I think it was actually Augustus, when he died, because he died in 4 BC. No, Herod died in 4 BC. But anyway, when the emperor Caesar Augustus died, there was a comet was spied in the heavens, and they said, that's Caesar. He has ascended to the heavens. He is on Mount Olympus. He has become a god among the gods. And this was a common belief in ancient cultures, was that the true kings and emperors were divine. They would ascend to heaven to be God. And Jesus does ascend to heaven in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts. And that ascension experience, again, this was an experience. This was not a literal. This was a vision. This was an interpretation of the life of Jesus, but also an interpretation of how we carry on the Galilean uprising, how we turn this local rebellion against empire into a global rebellion against empire. And they created Christianity, basically, as the vehicle through which they would do this. But this idea that Jesus was, in a certain sense, God was a problem, because Jesus was Jewish, and his earliest followers were all Jewish. They didn't believe in multiple gods. They didn't believe that Caesar Augustus rose to heaven to become a god. How could they believe that Jesus rose to heaven to sit at the right hand of God, which is how it was initially described, is Jesus has ascended to be at the right hand of God. You got to remember, people like to really get down on the Christians for their mythology, and the Jewish people too for their various mythologies. And I'm like, but the Romans and the Greeks had so much of the same mythology. The Emperor Caesar Augustus goes to heaven and sitting in the court of the gods. He wasn't at the right hand of God, and that, in fact, was the Jewish and the Christian twist on this myth that Caesar went to heaven. They're saying, well, Jesus went to heaven, and he's sitting right next to the one true God of the cosmos, who is not Zeus, is not Jupiter, but rather is, Mount Olympus. And, it's not Mount Olympus, it's heaven. They basically one-upped the story of Caesar Augustus by saying Jesus was God. But it created a problem. How do we understand the divinity of Jesus? Because Judaism did not have demigods. Greek myths and Roman myths had demigods, which are human god hybrids. Hercules was, I believe, was conceived by, Heracles. The Greek term for Hercules is Heracles. His mother was impregnated by Zeus, I believe, and that's why he was so powerfully strong. So Hercules was a myth about a god-man. Well, these early Jewish Christians, when they're proclaiming that Jesus was the true chosen emperor of the whole world, this counter-empire, this divine regime, this communism of love, that Jesus was the true emperor, the true king, this belief, they had to put it in terms that basically trumped the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was the anti-empire. The Roman Empire was anti-Christ. The Roman Empire was anti-messianic. The Roman Empire was the target of, was the source of Jewish oppression and the oppression of the slaves of the Roman Empire. And so as the early followers of Jesus are rebuilding their movement after the crucifixion of Jesus, they began to say, well, Jesus is the anti-Caesar. And so we're going to call him Lord. We're going to say he ascended to heaven and is at the right hand of the Father, because that means our cause is the true divine cause, and that the cause of the Roman Empire is an evil cause. They just want to dominate the world. They don't want to free us. They don't want to liberate humanity. So Jesus becomes God through that line of thought. And the early Christians didn't know what to do with that. Or I shouldn't say they struggled to really work it out, because it was almost like they were saying there were two gods. There was the God of Israel, and then there was Jesus. And the God of Israel was the father of Jesus. That was an early, because Jesus did refer to that God, the God of Israel, as his father. And of course, from that, they invented the virgin birth story. Oh, Jesus was God's father. It must have literally happened, because go back to the demigods, right? Hercules had Hercules was conceived by Zeus impregnating, or Heracles, Zeus impregnated Hercules' mother, Jupiter impregnated Hercules' mother, and we had a strong man, a demigod. Jesus was that, but Judaism wouldn't allow for a demigod, for God to somehow be for Jesus to be part man and part God. That just didn't happen in Judaism. And Jesus was a real human being, unlike Hercules, who was not a real human being. But maybe there was somebody who that story is based on, was a strong man who was so strong he had to have the power of God flowing through his vein. Jesus had the power of God flowing through his vein, but his power wasn't strength. His power was justice and love and compassion and forgiveness. The divine regime. Religion is the heart of a heartless world. It is a desire to place love at the center of human life. That's why I call the vision, the divine regime, the communism of love. Love's communism, because love is communism. Communism is love. God is love. Goddess is love. The divine being, the infinite being is love. So now I'm going to go back and say, what is theology? Theology in the Jesus frame, and I'm not talking just Christian frame, I'm talking about the Jesus frame, and particularly the earliest followers of Jesus who Jesus identified God as a father, a parent, a good father, not a bad father, and he constantly, there's constant comparisons of human fathers to the Heavenly Father in the writings of Jesus. And the Heavenly Father is always really good at it, and the human fathers are always really bad at being fathers. They give their children bread, not stone. Well, God gives children bread, not stone. And if your child is hungry, to give them a stone? No. Even a bad father knows to give his child bread. So this story that Jesus was somehow God, that Jesus was sitting at the right hand of God in heaven, because that justified the communist revolution that the early Christians were working on, the early followers of Jesus were trying to promote, was a communist revolution, a communist transformation of the world. So they said they had Jesus at the right hand of God. Well, okay, Jesus is in some sense God, but he's not a demigod like Hercules. What kind of a God is he? And the first formulation is what's known as modalism. And it was fairly popular. Basically, what modalism says is that God the Father assumed the humanity of Jesus. That is, he reached down into the womb of Mary, miraculously fertilized her egg. Now, you understand, they didn't understand reproduction the way we understand it. Aristotle believed that the Father basically squirted the child into the woman's womb, and the woman's womb was just a place for the child to grow up. They didn't realize that the woman actually contributed an egg to the, at least Aristotle didn't understand. So the ancient world was kind of confused about the stuff that we understand scientifically. Basically, what the Christian myth of a virgin birth is saying that, well, God took that fertilized ovum, that fetus, and united to it, because there was no human father, there was only the divine Father. Again, this is a myth. I'm not saying it's literally true. I know the virgin birth is a myth, and it's a story. Bear in mind, this is the Roman emperors were demigods. Hercules was a demigod. They were fathered by gods. They were humans who had the power of God in their veins because of who their invisible spirit god fathers were, who came to earth and impregnated human women to create gods on earth, demigods. The emperors were all demigods. And so this was a Jewish attempt to create a demigod in Jesus. But they couldn't stop at Jesus just being a demigod. He had to, in some sense, be God. And so they came up with this theory that Jesus was truly God and truly man, that truly human, that Jesus' human nature was assumed into the unity of the divine one God of Judaism, and that it was simply a mode of God's existence, that God in eternity had been Father, in Jesus God was Son, and that after Jesus died, God became Spirit. So there were three modes: Father, Son, Spirit. That worked for a while. But in the 3rd or 4th century, opposition came about. A guy named Tertullian, some other theologians like St. Gregory of Nyssa, Athanasius, they all said, this doesn't work. We got to get rid of this idea that Jesus is that the Father is just a mode of God and that the Son is just a mode of God. We have to say that Father, Son, and Spirit are all eternal. All three of them are eternal, because the eternal Spirit. And so they began to work on this doctrine called the Trinity. What the Trinity says is that all the way back in eternity, God was already three persons in one substance and one being. Remember, I said I'm talking about theology. Why is this relevant when I'm saying that religion is the heart of a heartless world? I'm getting to it. Why I think the Trinity is one of the most impressive theological feats ever. I don't believe it's literally true, but it's impressive. What they were saying is that God was the Father of Jesus, but as the second person of the Trinity, so that the personality that Jesus was, which was a divine personality incarnated in human flesh, had existed forever, just as God the Father had existed forever. So Father and Son existed forever. That's something that's really hard to wrap your head around. I didn't understand it until I was in my 20s. And I'd grown up with the Trinity, and I didn't understand why the Trinity was true, or I should say why it was considered so theologically critical, is because God the Father, God the Son, and then God the Spirit, these three persons in this one divine being, it's saying that this threeness existed forever. And the threeness is centered in relations. What are the relations of the Trinity? The Son, the second person of the Trinity, is begotten, that is generated, brought into being, fathered, nurtured, mothered, because God the Father is also God the Mother. The Son is the child, not just the son, it's also the daughter. It's also the child, the non-binary, non-gendered. So in the ancient, in the eternal past, God is parent and child without gender. But God is also Spirit, which is a wave. What do I mean when I say the Holy Spirit is a wave? We know that at the quantum level, everything is waves. We used to talk about particles, and now they talk about wavicles. Look it up. Google the word wavicles. The quantum phenomenon are waves, and everything is waves. Throughout the cosmos, everything is waves. So the spirit, which literally means breath or wind, that spirit is a wave. So we've got parent, child, and wave. And these three have always existed, and they're always related. And the wave proceeds from the father. The child proceeds from the parent. And I realize this is, you're like, you're losing. Why are you doing this? Why is this important? Here's why it's important. In the earlier model, where Jesus was basically simply assumed into the divine being, and so God, in a sense, became human by absorbing and assuming the life of this human being. But God is still alone. Before he became human, God is the only God. But the Trinity says it's a little more complicated than that. God is, in a sense, eternally interrelated. The parent, the child, and the spirit all are related eternally in a communion of love. God is love, because in order to love, there has to be an other to love. So then, in a sense, God, by being three persons in one being, is always and forever eternally a being with love. Love, not just love of self, but love of an other within oneself. I think that the doctrine of the Trinity is a mystical masterpiece. Not literally true. I am a pantheist. I believe that the infinite being is complicated. The infinite being is complex. The infinite being is the source of the multiverse. It brought everything into being. I don't fully understand, but I don't believe it's a simple unity. And that's what the Trinity is really about. It's saying we live in a cosmos, we live in a world where relationships, even, of course, human relationships and human and animal relationships, we understand those. Animals care for their young, birds feed their chicks. Animals care for each other. We know this. Humans care for the young. We know this. And what the doctrine of the Trinity says is that is eternal. The caring that a parent gives to a child is simply a finite manifestation of the infinite love that the first person of the Trinity has for the second person of the Trinity. God, the divine being, is love. Now, why does this matter for politics? Again, I talk about the communism of love. We are trying to create a world of perfect love. That's what we're trying to do. Communists are revolutionaries in the name of perfect love. And theology and religion is, if nothing else, true religion is focused primarily on love and the perfecting of human love here on earth. Even if you're in one of these supernatural religious modes where the goal of being a perfectly loving person on earth is to help people get to heaven. It's a love. It's a kind of weak love, but it's love. Try to help people get to heaven. Because I love people because I want people to become communists, to live in a world of communism, to get to heaven on earth. I don't down heaven. I want to live in heaven on earth. I don't think heaven is best envisioned as some far off, non-physical, floating around like ghosts. That's not heaven. But anyway, that's me. All right. So religion is the opium of the masses. It is the heart of a heartless world. It is the soul of souls conditions, because religion ultimately is about love, and love is ultimately manifested in communism. One of my favorite theologians is Cornel West, Reverend Dr. Cornel West, and he is fond of saying, justice is what love looks like in public. But I say, Dr. West, communism is what love will look like in public. It is collective love. It is revolutionary love. That is what religion is. Religion is focused on love. Science is focused on truth and knowledge. Ethics is focused on beauty and satisfaction, but love is focused on the good. What is the highest possible good that can be achieved by all of humanity? Not the second best, not the random. What is the truly perfect good that we can achieve? And that is love. And that's what theology is. The place of theology in the revolution is to keep our hearts centered on love, so that we always remember the reason we are fighting for the revolution, the reason we want communism, is because we are a people dedicated to love. Jesus was an advocate of love. Rosa Luxemburg was an advocate of love. Karl Marx was sort of an advocate of love. That's a whole other topic. Again, I may deal with that in another place. I think this is, again, one of the conflict that he had with Wilhelm Wittling after after Engels and Marx joined the League of the Just and transformed it into the Communist League and basically kicked Wilhelm Wittling, a Christian communist, out because they didn't like his gospel of love. Seriously, they kind of, that was one of the things they didn't like about Wilhelm Wittling, was his communism of love. They thought it was idealistic and sentimental and romantic, and they wanted scientific socialism. I have no beef with scientific socialism. I absolutely believe that, but I also believe scientific socialism is not enough unless it has love. That is human love in a certain disinterested sense of love at its heart. Love for everyone, not just, the good people and the bad versus the bad people, not just the, obviously the poor versus the rich, but yes, but even, there may be some rich who survived the revolution. They get a chance to be a part of the communism of love. So, religion is the opium of the masses, but it is also the heart of a heartless world. And it is that the Church of the Revolution preaches, is that whatever else you may believe about the divine being, you can be an atheist. And I ask you as an atheist, well, where does love come from? It comes from evolution. Birds have it. Kittens, a cat mothering her kittens, nursing her kittens, that's love. You can say it's not, but it is. All mammals love their young. And love is at the heart of the cosmos. It's not an accident. So I'm not arguing that there's a direction to evolution, but I'm saying that the emergence of love as an evolved relational dynamic in humans and in animals is a sign that the cosmos itself makes love possible. And I don't believe it was an accident in the strict sense of the term. I believe it was it emerged directly from the physical laws of the universe, that they created beings capable of love. I think that's, now I don't want to say it's built in, but I also don't want to say it's random. I want to say it flows from the laws of the cosmos. Okay, this has been a longer video than I think I have done so far. This has been nearly an hour, but I'm going to keep it because I like this version. I can tell that I didn't make as many, I didn't get lost like I did the first time I tried to do this video. So I'm going to put it up. And I'm just going to repeat, please subscribe to my channel. Please ring that bell so that you can get notified every time. Please go to my Patreon and consider subscribing me. Follow me on Twitter. Follow Church of the Revolution on Facebook. I might even accept friend requests. I accept most friend requests. There are a few that I won't. But anyway, just check in the description of the video. I have my link tree all laid out for you. Go there and figure out, if you really like the Commie Preacher, if you like the Church of the Revolution, we're getting ready. The pandemic is beginning to recede before scientific medical vaccinations, and we can go in person, and I can come to your town and preach the gospel of communism. So think about that. And I can do it now virtually. I can go anywhere. So please, subscribe, follow, invite me to give a presentation to your socialist organization or to your church. I would love to. All right, everybody. Radical revolutionary love is the heart of the evolutionary cosmos. It is what drives us to do what we are doing,